What if the person destroying your relationship was you? Not through cheating, not through lying, not through some huge, dramatic betrayal, but through something much quieter, through testing the one person who actually loved you over and over again, until there was nothing left of his patience to test. This is the story of a woman who had a genuinely good manual, calm, patient, steady. For 4 years, he never once raised his voice at her, and instead of feeling safe in that calm, she felt something else entirely suspicious. Like his patience wasn't real love. Like real love was supposed to look like chaos. So she started testing him. Small fights over nothing. Accusations without proof. And one night, she crossed a line she still can't forgive herself for. 2 weeks ago, that patient man finally reached his limit, not with anger, but with something far more painful: exhaustion. This is a real story shared on Reddit, and it's a little different from most stories on this channel, because this time, there's no villain to be angry at except the person telling the story herself. By the end of this video, you might find yourself thinking about your own relationships, your own patterns, in a way you didn't expect. Let's go through it from the beginning. The woman telling this story is 24 years old. We'll call her Emily, name changed for privacy. She was with her boyfriend, who we'll call Jake, 26 years old, for almost 4 years. 2 weeks before writing this post, he ended things. Emily opens with something rare and difficult to admit publicly. She says she finally understands the breakup was completely her fault. Not partially. Not, "We both made mistakes." Completely her fault, in her own words, without hedging. And what follows is one of the most self-aware breakdowns of a relationship pattern you'll find in a story like this. She describes Jake as one of those genuinely calm, patient people. In 4 years together, she never once saw him raise his voice at her. Whenever they disagreed about something, he always wanted to sit down and talk it through calmly. And here's the part that makes this story so different from typical relationship posts. Emily admits she hated that about him. To understand why, we need to understand where Emily came from. She grew up in a household where conflict looked completely different. Yelling, slamming doors, someone storming out of the house, and then, the next day, everyone pretending nothing had happened at all, as if the explosion the night before simply evaporated with the morning light. So when Jake wanted to calmly discuss a disagreement instead of exploding into anger, it felt foreign to Emily. Almost fake, like he wasn't reacting enough to actually care about what was happening between them. In her mind, shaped by everything she'd grown up around, calm didn't mean secure, it meant indifferent. Chaos, ironically, felt like proof of love, because chaos was the only version of caring she'd ever witnessed up close. This single detail is the emotional key to understanding everything that follows in this story. It's worth pausing here, because this dynamic is more common than people often realize. When a child grows up watching conflict expressed only through volume and drama, they can develop an internal template that equates emotional intensity with emotional investment. In that template, doesn't read as security, it reads as absence. As if the less dramatic a reaction is, the less a person must actually feel underneath it. This isn't a conscious belief most people would state out loud if asked directly. It operates more like a background assumption, quietly shaping how safe or unsafe steady love actually feels, long before a person even recognizes the pattern in themselves. Over time, without fully realizing what she was doing at first, Emily started testing Jake. She's remarkably honest about this in her post, even though it clearly costs her something to admit it. If he was 5 minutes late coming home, she'd bring up something completely unrelated from months earlier, just to see if he'd finally snap under the pressure. If he seemed distracted or tired after a long day, she'd accuse him of not caring about her anymore, purely to gauge how hard he'd fight to prove that he still did. And every single time, Jake responded the same way. He stayed calm. He reassured her. He tried to understand what was actually bothering her underneath the surface accusation. He never once gave her the explosive reaction she was subconsciously searching for. Here's the part of Emily's post that's genuinely difficult to read. Because of how honestly she names her own internal experience, she admits that some sick part of her almost felt disappointed every time he didn't react more strongly. Not because she wanted him to be cruel or angry toward her, but because his consistent calm didn't match the internal template she carried for what caring enough was supposed to look like. This is such an important psychological pattern to understand, because it explains so much of what happens later in the story. When someone grows up associating love with intensity, with volatility, with dramatic displays of emotion, genuine steady love can start to feel suspicious, almost unsettling. It doesn't match the emotional language they were taught to recognize as real. There's also something worth noting about how invisible this pattern can be, even to the person living inside it. Emily wasn't consciously trying to sabotage her relationship during these early tests. From her perspective at the time, she likely experienced these moments as legitimate concern, as simply needing reassurance. It's only in hindsight, with the clarity that comes after loss, that she can name what was actually happening a repeated, almost compulsive search for proof, dressed up as ordinary worry. About 8 months before this post, Emily did something she describes as deeply shameful, something that moves this story from insecure attachment patterns into an actual, serious boundary violation. She read Jake's private text messages with his best friend, who we'll call Ryan, without Jake's knowledge or permission. She was looking for proof of something she doesn't fully specify what she expected to find, only that she was searching for some kind of justification for the suspicion she already carried inside her. What she found was a message where Jake told Ryan that he sometimes felt like he was walking on eggshells with Emily. No. If you pause and really sit with that sentence, it's not a message about wanting to leave the relationship. It's not evidence of an affair, or of Jake talking badly about Emily behind her back in some malicious way. It's a man privately, honestly, confiding in his closest friend that the relationship felt tense and unpredictable to navigate. It was, in every sense, exactly the kind of wake-up call that should have prompted Emily to reflect on her own behavior. Instead, she turned it into a weapon. Weeks later, during an unrelated argument, she brought this message up, but not honestly. She twisted the context to make it sound like Jake had been talking behind her back about wanting to leave her entirely, which wasn't remotely what the actual message said or meant. When Jake found out she'd read his private messages, his reaction revealed something important about his character. He wasn't primarily defensive about what he'd written. He was hurt, more than anything, that she'd violated his privacy that way. And true to form, he asked her calmly why she'd felt the need to do that. Emily admits she couldn't answer honestly in that moment. She told him it was, because I needed to know the truth. But looking back now, she recognizes that wasn't the real reason at all. She thinks, in hindsight, that she simply wanted a justification, a reason to feel validated in the constant, low-grade suspicion she carried toward him, regardless of whether that suspicion had any basis in reality. This moment is worth examining closely, because the language Emily used in the aftermath, "I needed to know the truth," is such a common justification people offer themselves when a boundary has already been crossed. It sounds rational on the surface. It frames an invasive act as due diligence, as responsible caution, rather than what it actually was, a search for ammunition to support a narrative that had already been decided in advance, regardless of what evidence actually existed. This wasn't an isolated incident. Emily describes an ongoing pattern that continued well beyond the phone reading episode, one that repeated itself in various small forms over many months, each time following a remarkably similar shape. She'd pick fights over small, ultimately meaningless things: Jake spending time with his friends, Jake not texting back within an hour, Jake seeming too calm during a particularly hard week at his job, when according to her own logic, he should have been visibly stressed or distracted in a way that matched her own anxiety. Looking back on this pattern now, Emily recognizes what she was actually doing, even if she couldn't name it clearly at the time. She was chasing some kind of proof that Jake loved her enough to fall apart over her, enough to lose his composure, enough to show intensity that matched the chaotic version of love she'd grown up believing was normal. She simply didn't know how to trust that steady, consistent love without constantly testing whether it would hold. This is worth pausing on for a moment, because it reflects something incredibly common in relationships shaped by difficult or unpredictable childhoods, far beyond just this one couple's specific circumstances. People who grow up around chaotic, high-intensity conflict sometimes unconsciously interpret calm, secure love as a red flag rather than a gift. It doesn't match their internal definition of what caring should feel like. So instead of relaxing into the safety that a patient partner offers, they subconsciously manufacture crises, just to receive confirmation, again and again, that the person will still choose to stay. It's also worth noting that this pattern can be especially difficult to break because, from the inside, it doesn't feel like sabotage. It feels like vigilance. It feels like protecting yourself from a hurt you're certain is coming eventually, simply because that's what happened in every relationship modeled for you growing up. The tragedy is that this very vigilance, meant to prevent abandonment, often becomes the thing that eventually causes it. The tragic irony, of course, is that every successful test doesn't actually build lasting trust. It simply resets the anxiety until the next test feels necessary. It's a cycle that, left unaddressed, tends to escalate rather than resolve. Precisely because the underlying fear it's built on is never actually confronted directly. There's an important distinction worth making here between healthy reassurance seeking and this kind of repeated testing. Every relationship involves moments where one partner needs comfort, needs to hear, "I love you" after a hard day, needs a hug after feeling insecure. That's completely normal and healthy. What separates Emily's pattern from ordinary reassurance seeking is the manufactured nature of it deliberately picking fights, deliberately resurrecting old grievances, specifically to provoke a reaction rather than to resolve an actual, present concern. The goal wasn't understanding. The goal was confirmation, extracted through pressure rather than earned through honest vulnerability. 2 weeks before writing this post, the pattern reached its breaking point in a way that neither of them fully saw coming that evening. It started over something genuinely small. Jake forgot to mention he was grabbing dinner with a coworker in isolation. This is the kind of minor, forgettable oversight that happens constantly in any relationship. But for Emily, it became the trigger for a full spiral. She accused him of hiding things from her. She brought up the Ryan text again, resurrecting an 8-month-old wound. She dredged up months-old arguments that had, by all reasonable measures, already been resolved. And this time, something different happened. Jake didn't yell. He didn't even raise his voice, consistent with everything Emily had described about him across the entire relationship. Instead, he got very quiet, and he said something that Emily says she'll never forget. "I don't think I can keep proving I love you every single week. I'm tired, Emily. I don't have anything left to give you that will make you believe me." And then he told her he wanted to end things. Not with anger, not with cruelty, just with a kind of quiet, complete exhaustion, like something inside him had simply run out. After years of steadily giving without ever feeling like it was enough, Emily describes begging him in that moment. She cried. She told him she changed. And Jake, true to who he'd been throughout the entire relationship, responded gently rather than coldly. He told her he believed she wanted to change, but he explained that he couldn't keep being tested to see whether he would break under pressure. He said he needed someone who felt safe with him, not someone who needed him to prove himself over and over, week after week, with no end in sight. He moved his belongings out 3 days later. Emily notes, almost painfully, that he remained kind throughout the entire process. Still calm, still exactly the Jake he'd always been. And she admits that this consistency, this refusal to become cruel or vindictive even while ending things, somehow made the whole experience even harder to bear. There's something particularly devastating about a breakup handled with grace rather than anger. When a partner leaves cruelly, there's often at least a target for hurt feelings to attach to. Some justification for anger that can, in strange ways, make the grieving process feel more straightforward. But when someone leaves the way Jake did, calmly, kindly, without a single vindictive word, the person left behind is often forced to sit with the full weight of their own responsibility, with no external anger available to soften or redirect that reckoning. In the week following the breakup, Emily finally started therapy, something she acknowledges, with a hint of self-directed frustration, she probably should have done long before this crisis point. Her therapist offered her a gentle but clarifying insight. Emily had likely been recreating the chaos she grew up around, because on some subconscious level, chaos had always felt like proof that someone genuinely cared. Calm, by contrast, had come to feel like indifference. She had, in effect, associated peace itself with being unloved. So without fully realizing it, she kept manufacturing small storms within her relationship, testing again and again whether Jake would stay through them, whether he would finally show her the intensity she associated with real love. And he did stay. Every single time. Until, finally, he couldn't anymore. This insight from Emily's therapist points to something psychologically significant that extends well beyond this one relationship. Attachment patterns formed in childhood, particularly around what conflict and love are supposed to look like, often operate almost entirely outside of conscious awareness. People don't usually wake up one day and consciously decide, "I'm going to sabotage my healthy relationship," because deep down it feels unfamiliar. Instead, the sabotage tends to feel, in the moment, like legitimate suspicion, like justified insecurity, like simply needing to know the truth, exactly the phrase Emily herself used when confronted about reading Jake's messages. It's only with distance, and often with professional guidance, that the actual underlying pattern becomes visible for what it really was. This delayed recognition is worth sitting with for a moment, because it applies far beyond Emily's specific situation. So many people carry attachment patterns formed decades earlier, patterns that quietly steer their adult relationships without ever announcing themselves clearly. It often takes a genuine crisis, a breakup, a painful confrontation, a therapist's carefully worded observation to finally bring an invisible pattern into conscious view. Before that moment, the behavior simply feels like personality, like just how I am, rather than a learned response to an environment that no longer exists. When Emily shared this story, the response from the community was notably different from most viral relationship posts, largely because there was no clear external villain to direct anger toward, just an unusually honest self-reflection. One of the top comments called this one of the most self-aware posts on the entire subreddit, pointing out that many people in Emily's exact situation would still be blaming their ex-partner for not fighting hard enough to save the relationship. The fact that Emily could see her own pattern this clearly, even though it came too late to save this particular relationship, was seen by this commenter as a genuinely significant first step. Another commenter focused specifically on the moment Emily read Jake's private messages, noting that this was the exact point where the story shifted from simple insecure attachment into an actual boundary violation. This commenter appreciated that Emily herself recognized this distinction too, rather than minimizing or excusing that specific action. One particularly popular comment zeroed in on Emily's line about associating peace with being unloved, calling it a genuinely powerful, gut punch observation. This commenter pointed out that many people who grow up around chaos simply don't know what calm, secure love actually looks like, so they unconsciously recreate conflict because it feels familiar, even as it quietly destroys something genuinely good in their lives. Several commenters specifically praised the fact that Emily wasn't asking for advice on how to win Jake back, recognizing that this wasn't really the point of her post at all. As one commenter put it, Jake had given her 4 years of patience, and she was only now doing the internal work she'd needed to do all along, work that needed to happen regardless of whether the two of them ever reconciled. Another comment offered a broader observation about the nature of testing a partner in general, describing it as a pattern that almost never works the way people hope. Testing someone doesn't actually confirm whether they love you, it simply slowly consumes their patience, until eventually there's nothing left. And by the time the person doing the testing realizes what they were doing, it's often already too late to reverse the damage. One comment highlighted something particularly poignant about the nature of this specific breakup: the fact that Jake never once yelled, never became cruel, never punished Emily for any of this throughout the entire relationship. He simply, quietly reached his limit. According to this commenter, these types of breakups, ones without a dramatic villain moment to be angry at, are often the hardest to recover from, precisely because there's no external target for the pain, only quiet exhaustion on one side and quiet regret on the other. Several commenters expressed genuine hope that Emily would continue her therapy work regardless of the outcome with Jake, noting that many people post something similar, receive validation in the comments, and then never actually follow through on the deeper self-work required to break the pattern. They saw it as a positive sign that Emily was already specifically focusing on attachment-related work, rather than solely processing the breakup itself. And, as is common with especially honest, vulnerable posts like this one, several people shared that this story hit uncomfortably close to home, admitting they'd recognized very similar patterns in their own past relationships, often not until well after those relationships had already ended. A few commenters also brought a slightly different angle into the discussion, focusing specifically on Jake's side of the story, even though he wasn't the one writing the post. One commenter pointed out that Jake spent 4 years absorbing this pattern without ever becoming cruel or resentful, and how he expressed his eventual exhaustion, and wondered aloud whether Jake had his own blind spot, perhaps staying far longer than was healthy for himself, hoping his consistency alone would eventually be enough to resolve Emily's underlying insecurity, when that kind of internal work was never something he could do for her, no matter how patient he remained. Another comment offered a word of caution to other readers who might see themselves in Emily's story, warning against swinging too far in the opposite direction, becoming so afraid of testing a partner that legitimate concerns go unspoken entirely. The real lesson, according to this commenter, isn't to suppress every insecurity, but to bring concerns forward honestly and directly, rather than manufacturing conflict as an indirect way of seeking reassurance. Let's step back from Emily and Jake's specific situation and consider the broader lessons this story offers, because unlike stories centered on betrayal or deception, this one offers insight into a much quieter, and arguably more common, way that relationships can quietly erode from within. The way you were raised shapes what love feels like to you, often without your awareness. Emily didn't consciously choose to distrust calm, patient love. It was shaped by an entire childhood environment where conflict looked like yelling and slamming doors, and resolution looked like collective, unspoken denial the next morning. Recognizing these formative patterns is often the necessary first step toward not repeating them in adult relationships. Testing a partner rarely builds the security it's meant to create. Each time Emily manufactured a small crisis to see if Jake would stay, it didn't actually resolve her underlying insecurity, it simply reset the anxiety until the next test felt necessary. Genuine security in a relationship comes from addressing the root fear directly, not from repeatedly confirming, through manufactured conflict, that a partner hasn't left yet. Privacy violations are a serious breach, regardless of the underlying insecurity that motivates them. Reading Jake's private messages wasn't simply a symptom of insecurity, it was an active violation of his trust and privacy. Emily's own honest recognition of this distinction, rather than excusing it entirely as a byproduct of her anxiety, is an important and mature acknowledgement. Consistent calm from a partner is not evidence of indifference. One of the most valuable, if painful, lessons in this story is the recognition that a partner's steady, non-reactive patience is not proof that they don't care. In fact, it often reflects the opposite, a deliberate choice to remain present and understanding, even during difficult moments, rather than escalating into the kind of chaos that feels destructive rather than loving. Even good, patient people have limits. Jake's steady calm across 4 years didn't mean he was endlessly capable of absorbing repeated testing without consequence. His eventual exhaustion is an important reminder that patience, no matter how genuine, isn't infinite. Partners are not obligated to continuously prove their love through repeated tests, and reaching a limit after sustained testing doesn't make someone less loving, it makes them human. Self-awareness, even when it arrives too late to save a specific relationship, still has real value. Emily's honest reflection, her willingness to name her own role in the breakup without deflecting blame onto Jake, represents genuinely important growth. While it didn't save this particular relationship, this kind of clarity is precisely what can prevent the same pattern from repeating in future relationships, provided the underlying work continues. And patience from a partner is not the same as an obligation to endlessly absorb harm. It's worth acknowledging, gently, that Jake's 4 years of calm endurance, while admirable, also raises a quieter question about his own patterns, why he stayed as long as he did, absorbing repeated testing without ever insisting on a boundary earlier in the relationship. Healthy relationships require both partners to advocate for their own needs, not just patiently endure the other's unresolved fears indefinitely. Jake's eventual exit, rather than an earlier boundary, may itself be worth reflecting on as its own kind of lesson. Sometimes patience without boundaries simply delays an inevitable breaking point rather than preventing it. This is a slightly different question than in most stories on this channel, because the central relationship has already ended, and Emily isn't asking how to reverse that outcome. Instead, the more relevant question is, what does meaningful growth look like from here? Continuing therapy, specifically focused on attachment patterns, is one clear place to start. Emily mentioned she's specifically working on attachment-related issues, not just processing the breakup itself. This distinction matters significantly. Understanding attachment styles, how early relationships with caregivers shape adult patterns around trust, conflict, and security, can help Emily recognize these patterns earlier in future relationships, before they escalate to the point of testing a partner's patience to its breaking point. Rebuilding a different relationship with conflict itself matters too. Part of Emily's healing likely involves learning that calm conflict resolution isn't a sign of insufficient caring, but rather a healthier alternative to the chaotic conflict she grew up around. Over time, with conscious effort, it's possible to recalibrate what safety and love actually feel like, even after years of a very different internal template. Respecting the space Jake has asked for, without using this reflection as a strategy to win him back, is another important piece. Emily explicitly stated she isn't posting this hoping for advice on reconciliation, and that she's respecting Jake's request for space. This distinction is important, because genuine self-work looks different from performative growth aimed at manipulating a specific outcome. Real change happens regardless of whether it results in getting a particular person back, and ideally, it's pursued because it's necessary for Emily's own future relationships, not merely as a means to reverse this one specific breakup. And finally, accepting that this relationship may not be recoverable, and that this is okay. Sometimes the most important growth a person experiences comes directly from a relationship that didn't survive. Jake gave Emily 4 years of patience, and while that patience eventually ran out, the clarity Emily gained from this experience, however painful, may serve as the foundation for a healthier relationship in her future, one where she doesn't need to manufacture chaos to feel loved. There's also something to be said for how Emily chooses to carry this experience forward, beyond simply avoiding the same specific mistakes. Real change isn't only about not repeating the exact behaviors, reading a partner's messages, manufacturing arguments over small things. It's about addressing the deeper fear underneath those behaviors, the belief that calm equals indifference. Until that core belief is genuinely examined and reshaped, even with the best intentions, similar patterns can quietly resurface in new relationships, simply wearing a different disguise. What makes this story so different from most relationship stories is that there's no clear villain to direct anger toward, no secret betrayal to uncover, no shocking twist involving another person. Just one woman's honest, difficult admission that she didn't know how to accept a love that didn't match the chaos she'd grown up believing was normal, and a patient man who, after 4 years of steady effort, simply had nothing left to give. It raises an important, uncomfortable question worth sitting with. Have you ever mistaken calm for indifference? Have you ever tested someone you loved just to feel reassured they wouldn't leave, without realizing that every test slowly chips away at the very security you were trying to build? If this story resonated with you, whether you recognize yourself in Emily, or in Jake, or simply in the pattern itself, let us know in the comments. This is clearly a topic that touches something many people have quietly experienced, but rarely talk about so openly. Maybe you've been the one testing a partner's patience without fully realizing it. Maybe you've been the one quietly absorbing someone else's insecurity, hoping consistency alone would eventually be enough. Or maybe, like so many commenters admitted, you're only recognizing one of these patterns in yourself now, looking back at a relationship that's already ended. Wherever you find yourself in this story, the most important step is simply naming the pattern honestly, the same way Emily finally did, even when that honesty arrives later than you wish it had. If this video made you think, give it a like, and subscribe for more real stories like this one every week. And if you recognize this pattern in your own life right now, know that recognizing it, the way Emily eventually did, is genuinely the first and most important step toward changing it, even if, like her, that recognition comes after something has already been lost. See you in the next video. Until then, remember that calm isn't the absence of love. Sometimes, it's the clearest, quietest evidence of it, the kind of evidence that's easy to miss if you've never been taught to look for it. And if you're currently the one offering that calm, patient love to someone who keeps testing it, remember that your patience matters too. Loving someone well doesn't mean absorbing unlimited harm without ever naming your own limits. Sometimes the healthiest thing you can do, for both people involved, is speak up long before you reach the point of complete exhaustion.